I'm going to tell you about something rather disturbing that happened to me on my third job. In order for you to better understand why it affected me so much, I'll give you a little context about me. I grew up in a home with only my mother. She was always very loving and supportive, but I think the pressure to find a new partner led her to make some pretty bad decisions. My dad left shortly after I was born, and from then on, my mom started dating several men. It was kind of like a dating circus, where she would bring home someone new every few weeks, and while some would stay a little longer, most would lose interest pretty quickly. But the thing is, she didn't seem to realize that a bar isn't the best place to find a decent husband. Occasionally, things got pretty tense, and more than once she got into a fight with the guy she brought home. And if the wine was around, things got even more complicated. As a result of all this chaos, I became a complacent child, so long as I avoided all conflict, and that attitude ended up haunting me into adulthood, leading me to fall into anxiety attacks whenever a tense situation arose. That said, my story begins in 2016, when I was bouncing from job to job. At the time, I wasn't having any luck finding something in my field, so a friend suggested I try house sitting, something that painted me as a permanent vacation, just what I needed at the time. My friend gave me a couple of tips and helped me get my first client. I was very nervous that day, but I managed to get through it, and in the end I got paid and everything went well. The second client was easier, but what really shook me up was the third one. It was mid-2017 when I answered an ad to take care of a house that was a few hours away from here. It was my first long-distance experience, and I didn't want to muddy it up, so I made a list of questions, and my friend helped me polish it up. I called the owner, a very busy guy, and we made an appointment so I could see the house, but when I arrived, he seemed more interested in leaving than explaining the details to me. Basically, my job would be to receive packages and take care of his dog, a Saint Bernard named Rocky. When I met him, the dog didn't even look at me, just gave him a sniff and settled back into his bed, so I figured it would be an easy job. Eventually, we both agreed to let me take care of the house. That night, I checked into a hotel and returned to the house the next morning. My mission was to take care of Rocky and stay for 3 nights. I was excited, as the house was very nice, quite comfortable, and I was dying to go there and relax. And if I was lucky, I could play a little with the dog. At the end of the day, we did spend time together, but Rocky just wanted to rest, so we laid in the garden, enjoying a sunny afternoon, and the peace of the place comforted me. After a nice nap, I decided it was time to go inside for dinner, so I ordered a pizza and helped myself to some ice cream in front of the TV, while Rocky settled in next to me. The truth is, the dog was being a great companion. However, just as we were about to finish the movie, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a normal doorbell ring, but someone was pressing it over and over again, as if they had a lot of urgency. It was already past 5 o'clock in the afternoon at that point, and I had no idea that someone would come to visit so late. For a moment, I thought I could ignore the doorbell, but the insistence made me wonder if anyone really needed help, so I finally got up and opened the door. To my surprise, on the other side was a woman who seemed quite aggressive in her posture. But before I could say a word, she began to speak to me in a very upset, almost violent manner. With a lump in my throat, I felt the situation change rapidly. I tried to understand what was going on, but I couldn't concentrate on what she was saying, because her energy only filled me with uneasiness. Suddenly, everything became confusing, and all of a sudden, the tranquility I had felt because of the beautiful day I had spent vanished in a second. The threat presented by the woman at the door was evident, and immediately Rocky began to growl, showing his protection towards me. All this while I tried to deal with her words, and my mind was working at a mile a minute, thinking about how to escape from that situation. At that moment, what had started as a simple job like the others had turned into a total nightmare. I just hoped this didn't turn out to be a horror story more real than I ever imagined. The woman kept yelling at me, and all I could make out was that she kept mentioning the owner of the house, the man who hired me, and trying to get her to calm down. I tried to explain that he was away on business, but she didn't seem to believe me. The more she talked, the more upset she became, and every word she said made me more nervous, not knowing how to make her realize that I wasn't a threat. Suddenly, she started to call me names, calling me horrible things because she thought I was the new girlfriend of the owner of the house. And at that moment, I realized that Rocky had appeared behind me. Then his demeanor changed. He became more determined as the woman became more aggressive with me. Suddenly, what had already started as a tense conversation now turned into a chaos of shouting and barking. In my mind, panic was starting to take over, and Rocky's barking echoed like thunder down the hallway, and it seemed like he was going to pounce on her at any moment. I don't know how it happened, but some sentence I blurted out caused the woman to launch herself at me with an aggressiveness I had rarely seen in a girl, and she began to drag me by the hair and scream expletives at me. I tried to defend myself, but it was useless. This woman was a beast. Meanwhile, Rocky kept barking at her, and in a stroke of luck, when the woman knocked me to the floor and was preparing to kick me with the spiked boots she was wearing, Rocky lunged at her, knocking me flat on my butt on the floor and giving me time to get inside and close the door just in time. After that, the dog calmed down a bit, moved a few steps away and sat down, but wouldn't take his eyes off the door. I, on the other hand, slid down the frame, feeling terror consume me alive. At that moment, I began to have one of the worst panic attacks of my life, as she continued to scream and bang on the door on the other side. I was convinced I was going to lose control at that instant, but Rocky stood there, attentive, and after a few minutes of internal struggle, I managed to muster enough courage to call the police. The operator was incredibly understanding and calm, guiding me until help arrived. When the officers arrived, the woman was still yelling insults and threats at me and kicking the door. I was clear about how this woman had tried to attack me, but it only took them seeing the woman's attitude to realize that I wasn't overreacting one bit. Fortunately, they took the crazy woman away, and only at that point was I able to breathe a little, although I'm not sure if she was formally arrested. All I can say is that I was a nervous wreck. My heart was almost about to jump out of my chest, and I just wanted to run out of that house as soon as possible. But I knew I had to contact the owner of the house. When I called him, he was very apologetic. The poor guy apologized a lot and begged me not to leave. It turns out that this woman was his wife, whom he was divorcing. And although I didn't know what the context was, much less was I going to ask him, it didn't take much for me to realize that her unhealthy jealousy had something to do with that separation. What a hell the poor guy must have gone through, I muttered to myself. But despite my common sense, I ended up agreeing to stay a couple more nights, since, as I told you before, I've always been a bit of a pleaser. Plus, I didn't want to leave Rocky alone after he had tried to protect me. Finally, we agreed that my pay would be doubled, and although it sounded like extortion to me, and I knew it might damage my reputation, I decided I should accept. I needed every penny until I found another job. Fortunately, the next 2 nights were surprisingly quiet. Rocky stayed by my side the whole time, which made leaving that situation even more difficult. The owner of the house came back the morning of my last day and explained to me with a tone of embarrassment that this woman was his wife, and he had loved her very much, but it had all ended because of her possessive and violent behavior, and that was why he had asked her for a divorce. I didn't ask him any more questions. I'd had enough drama for a while. They had already paid me, so the only thing tying me to that place was Rocky, with whom I became very fond of in that short time. Before I left, I bent down and gave the little dog a big hug, saying goodbye to my hero, and I couldn't stop some tears from starting to flow. I didn't want to be a spectacle, so I took a deep breath and said goodbye before running to my car. That was hands down the scariest experience I've ever had in my life as a house sitter, and I'm not going to miss it at all. But Rocky I will carry in my heart forever. Did any of you ever get to see that famous video of a guy named Rodney on a dating show back in the late 70s? Maybe not, but this guy was called in for that show not knowing he was a serial killer. I happened to meet Rodney, but I met him long before anyone else, before he made his first victim. I met him at a neighborhood party. He was charismatic and had this charm and a smile that could light up the place, so I never suspected that behind that facade was a monster. Rodney was very different from the boys his age. While everyone was talking about sports or cars, he would get into conversations about art and philosophy. His genuine interest in those deep subjects grabbed me from the first moment and made me interested in him. But more than that, Rodney made me feel special, like I was the only person who really mattered in his world. Our first date was in a small, quiet cafe, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The conversation flowed as if we had known each other all our lives, and in that instant I thought I had found someone truly special. Eventually we started hanging out frequently, and at first everything seemed perfect, but gradually warning signs began to emerge. Rodney was too controlling all the time, always wanting to know where I was and who I was with. If I was late for an appointment, he would get so visibly upset that it made me uneasy. Once we met in the library, and I noticed that he was watching others, but not in a casual way. It was as if he was analyzing them, evaluating their every move. When I asked her why she was looking like that, she just laughed and changed the subject, but the uncomfortable feeling did not leave me. Besides, he had a strange obsession with the macabre. He enjoyed telling me about crimes and murders, giving me disturbing details about real cases. At first I thought it was curious, but then that started to send shivers down my spine. His eyes would sparkle with an unsettling excitement whenever he mentioned violent things. One night, while we were watching a horror movie at his house, he looked at me with a strange smile and asked, "Have you ever thought about how easy it would be to make someone disappear?" I froze, not knowing what to say. Then he laughed and said he was just joking, but the awkwardness hung in the air. As our relationship progressed, Rodney became more possessive and jealous. His jealousy was so over the top that I often found myself justifying my friendships and decisions to him, and my friends were quick to notice and warn me to be very careful. One night he invited me to dinner at his house, and I, as usual, accepted, thinking that a quiet evening might help improve things between the two of us, but I was wrong. At first, the dinner was pleasant, but soon the conversation turned dark. Rodney started talking again about his fascination with violence, and after dinner, he took me to his room and opened a drawer, pulling out a collection of knives. "Look at these," he said, smiling. "Each one has a story. Would you like me to tell you?" His attitude was very disturbing, and then he added, "They haven't broken someone's skin yet. But soon. At that constant, I felt a wave of discomfort and decided it was time to leave. I told him my parents would worry if I was late. "You're special," she told me. "Don't worry." Those words echoed in my head as I walked out, wishing I had never met him. "I'm going to get better for you. I won't let you go," he said in a tone that sounded more threatening than sweet, and it made my skin crawl. Immediately, I knew I was in trouble, and though I wanted to get away from him, I had no idea how to do it without igniting his anger. As the days passed, the situation became increasingly unsettling. He started showing up at my house and school unannounced, as if he was always watching. He no longer bothered to disguise his visits, but would just stand there, with that smile on his face, waving at me from afar, even though I told him he didn't need to come. He was no longer frustrated as he used to be. On the contrary, he seemed to be at his best, always smiling. Sometimes I wondered why I hadn't told my parents, or why I hadn't called the police. The truth is, you don't know what it's like to have someone like Rodney so close. It was like he was in control of my life, and I felt like every decision I made was the wrong one. If I called the police, I was afraid he'd flip out and do something horrible to me. If I told my parents, I imagined I might hurt them. The only option I saw was to play along, as if that was the only way to survive his hallucinatory presence. More than being his girl, I felt like his hostage. One Friday night, Rodney insisted that we go on a special date. He took me to a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, an old, abandoned park, supposedly to enjoy a romantic evening in the moonlight. When we arrived at the place, everything was so quiet that I could feel my own heart beating. The darkness enveloped me, and although I tried to appear calm, I couldn't help but feel fear consuming me. During the tour, Rodney started chatting about his obsession with death, and that immediately made me uneasy. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about how fragile life is," he said in his captivating tone. "It's amazing how a single move can change everything. With a simple gesture, it can end everything in an instant." I tried to change the subject, but then he moved closer and started whispering, as if he was sharing a secret, even though we were completely alone. "Imagine this. If someone wanted to get rid of you, they'd just have to make sure no one suspected. One push, one fall, and everything would look accidental." Inside me, adrenaline was pumping as I heard these chilling words, and I knew I had to act, but fear had me paralyzed. He knew he had the power to finish me off in the blink of an eye. Why was he telling me this? Why was he trying to terrify me? The truth was that he seemed to enjoy it. The atmosphere was becoming more and more suffocating, and in a desperate attempt to remain calm, I searched for an exit as Rodney continued to talk, becoming more and more excited by his own disturbing words. Finally, I found the courage to stand up to him. "Rodney, this is not normal. You need help," I said, trying to sound firm, but he didn't flinch. The smile was still on his face, but his eyes were filled with an unsettling calm. Then he grabbed my arm, and though his voice remained soft, there was a sinister tone to it. "Honey, you don't understand. I don't need help. I'm fine. I feel amazing. I'm a happy man, and I can be even more so. Rodney, this makes me uncomfortable. I want to go home, please," I replied in a shaky voice. "I have very strong feelings for you. That's why I want to give you a gift, a poem. You will be my muse, the first of my inspiration," he said. At that instant, I tried to break free from his grip, but it was useless. He pushed me against a tree, grabbed me by the neck, and started to strangle me. I tried to fight like never before. I clawed and kicked, but his strength overcame me. It was as if I was sinking into despair, with no refuge in sight. My mind screamed for escape, but terror gripped me. I couldn't bear to think that this was my reality. As he strangled me, he looked at me with a smile that chilled my blood. But his look, I couldn't describe it. It was that look that was somewhere between that of a lover and that of a madman enjoying the moment. Meanwhile, I was desperately trying to free myself from his grip, and in a last attempt, when I felt that I had almost no strength left, I managed to hit him with my knee in the crotch. At that moment, he let out a choked groan of pain and finally loosened his grip, but just enough for me to escape. As soon as I felt free, I ran like the devil himself was chasing me, feeling like my lungs were about to explode and my legs were shaking with fear. The feeling that he was right behind me pushed me to keep going, although I didn't dare look over my shoulder. But as I went on, his voice became more distant, and instead of shouting at me, he only laughed loudly, which increased my terror. Finally, I reached the main road, where I saw the lights of an approaching car. I waved my arms frantically, begging for the driver to stop, and to my surprise, the car stopped and an older couple let me in. With tears in my eyes, I told them what had happened, and they took me without hesitation to the nearest police station. Once there, I tried to explain my experience, but I felt ridiculous listening to myself. The officers took my details and promised to investigate, but they had this skeptical look on their faces that made me feel even more helpless. I knew Rodney was still on the loose, and the chances of anyone doing anything about it were very slim. That night I returned to my parents' house, terrified and exhausted. I couldn't stop thinking about how Rodney could show up at the door at any moment. My parents tried to comfort me, but the fear was too overwhelming. Days passed, and although he never returned, the anxiety didn't go away. It was as if he was always by my side, even when I knew I had made the right decision in walking away from him. I felt furious at my own vulnerability. My life could not go on while he surely laughed at everything I had done. Eventually, my parents decided it was best to move to another city, and although I hated the idea of leaving everything behind, I recognized that it was the only way to escape that constant sense of danger, so we moved quickly, and I began a new life away from Rodney. A few years passed, and to my surprise, I thought I'd completely forgotten him. But one fateful day, while watching television, I saw an old acquaintance, obviously Rodney, on a dating show. At that moment, all my terror came rushing back. I tried to contact the show, but they told me that it was already taped and that they had more information about him than I did. Then I found out that Rodney had not only been on TV, but he had murdered several women and the police were looking for him. At that moment, the monster that had been haunting my mind became real. I couldn't stop thinking about how unlucky I had been to run into him. But right after that call, I began to understand that I had actually been very, very lucky. I had run into a Rodney inexperienced in the art of assassination, and most of all, he had survived to tell the story. That revelation filled me with a kind of strange relief. I had won at the end of the day against the horror he tried to inflict. Let me share a piece of advice that you should keep very much in mind. Never trust the person who makes you uncomfortable, let alone get into a relationship without knowing that person well. Why do I tell you this? Because I've been there, and believe me, it didn't end well. This was about 6 years ago. I was a guy who had never been in a real relationship in his life, so when I had the opportunity to date a beautiful girl named Sarah, I thought it was my big moment. I was a real nerd, and let's be honest, the girls at school and college weren't interested in a guy like me. They only noticed the cute guys or the rich guys, so I was one of those outcasts, always having a hard time and hoping that some girl would give me a chance too. But my graduation day came, and that was my resolution. I had to get a date no matter what, so I created profiles on various dating apps. That's where I met Sarah. She was absolutely the most beautiful girl I had ever seen in my life. She told me that she also used to be considered a nerd at her school, but I couldn't believe that. If she really was a nerd, she must be the prettiest in the world. Sarah and I started talking, and one day she asked me out. I couldn't believe it. We decided to meet at a cafe the next day, and as soon as she walked in, I felt like everything changed. Suddenly, all eyes were on her, and it was as if a celebrity had walked in. Sarah had silky smooth skin, her long black hair looked spectacular, and her eyes were such an intense blue that I got lost in them like a shipwrecked sailor in the ocean. Besides, her voice was beautiful, like a song. God, I was so happy and at the same time, so insecure. Everyone there seemed jealous of me for being with her. We talked a lot, and every time she laughed, I felt like everything was blooming, like spring. As we left, she asked me if she could go to my house, as she flirtatiously played with her hair, and I just reacted by saying yes, without thinking. I mentioned to her that I lived alone, and as soon as we walked in, she started undressing and kissing me right away. I was on cloud 9. I couldn't believe how lucky I was. That night, we were intimate in every corner of my home. It was my first time, and I never imagined I would feel something so incredible. She made sure everything was perfect, but after all, she just got dressed and left without saying a word. I didn't know what to think. Even though the night was magical, something inside me started to give me a bad feeling, and that feeling didn't go away, even as I cleaned up the mess that was left after what had happened. Now I look back and think, if only I had been paying attention to the signs. After that night, I felt restless. I wanted to hold Sarah in my arms again, but I was never given the chance. The next 3 days we didn't talk much, and I felt nervous, because it was a new relationship, and besides, it was my first time. I was trying to reconnect with her, but it was as if she wasn't that interested in giving me a clear answer. Could it be that she hadn't liked me? I thought and tortured myself with that. I mean, I was a novice in the matter, and the fact that she had moved away filled me with insecurity. In the end, I decided to write her a message. I asked her if she had enjoyed the night as I did, and her answer was a relief. Yes, I loved it. It was amazing. I was thrilled to read that, but then I was surprised when she told me she was planning a surprise road trip. The idea of a trip with me made me feel great. My ego was through the roof, so I agreed right away. The plan was to meet that very afternoon, and I couldn't contain my excitement. That night I was so anxious I couldn't sleep. The next day, I got up early and spent all day preparing for the trip. I had even packed some sex toys to use on our way, and in my mind, it was going to be wild and fun. Finally, evening came, and we met up to go out. I was a little surprised that Sarah didn't bring anything but her purse, but I thought it might just be her clothes, and I didn't think anything more of it. I just got ready to enjoy this new encounter. We started driving, me at the wheel and her in the passenger seat, and after about 1 minutes, I started to notice that her hands were playing on my legs, which got me really excited. And then, well, let's just say it started to feel good. I was so into the moment that I decided to park the car on the side of the road, in a place that looked deserted. No one was in sight. I started kissing her and taking off what was left of her clothes, but just as I was enjoying myself to the fullest, I got a shiver as I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I opened my eyes and froze as I saw that she was holding a knife stained with blood. I was shocked for a moment, and before I could react, she tried to stab me again, but I managed to hold her hand. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked her, confused. "Come on, this will be fun," she replied with a crooked laugh, as if she was crazy. "I've done this before and it's very exciting. Your blood will cover me while we do it, and then I'll rest on your corpse." I was freezing. I couldn't believe it. This girl was completely crazy. At that point, I lost my cool and tried to stop her, but she wasn't giving up, and to be honest, she was stronger than I imagined. I was struggling with her to try to get the knife away from her, but she was trying to stick it in my chest at all costs and managed to hurt me a couple of times. I knew I had to go to the hospital soon, or it would be the end of me. Then, in the middle of the fight, I pushed her too hard, and accidentally her arm bent and the knife went into her own throat. Terrified, I pulled the knife out and stabbed her again, this time to make sure she didn't get up, and her life was snuffed out in front of my eyes. Not knowing what to do, I drove her body to a cliff and drove my car over the edge with her inside. Fear came over me as I watched my car be swallowed by the sea along with Sarah. For the next few days, I was extremely worried about the possible discovery, but there was no news of her. As a precaution, I did not want to go to a hospital, but treated my wounds at home, at the risk of doing something wrong and ending up dead myself. But luckily, they were all superficial. The one on my chest took longer to heal because it was deeper, and at one point it scared me. But then it began to heal normally. To this day, that experience haunts me, and since then, I've decided not to go out anymore. Not because I'm a dating failure or a nerd. No, it's because every time I try to go out again, panic invades me. I think, what if something like that happens to me again? Maybe this time, maybe I wouldn't make it out alive. Henry Evans was the only guy who ever called me pretty. But every time he did, I felt as if something would snap inside me, as if his compliment was almost a joke. Even though I smiled and nodded, deep down I found it hard to believe him. Other people called me by many names, La Chica Ojona, La Narizona, and the more daring ones just called me La Fea. I had never seen myself as an attractive person, because for as long as I can remember, I was always a very unattractive person. In my family, at school, and everywhere I went, people never wanted to be friends with me because of my unusual features. I started to hate myself, but what I hated most was the attitude of others. I met Henry on my first day of college. We were both studying psychology and, surprisingly, he called me pretty. The sincerity of his compliment should have infuriated me, but I just chose to ignore it and walked away. But Henry didn't give up, not only on that day, but in the weeks that followed. He was after me persistently. I didn't plan on falling in love with him. I had never allowed a boy into my heart. But Henry's insistence drove me crazy. Every day, he would show up at my desk with coffee and toast before each class. Afterwards, he would offer me copies of his notes, always calling me pretty. He would tell me that he loved my eyes and hair, that he loved my naturalness, which is why, even though I didn't want to accept it, I felt that maybe there was something special about me. My mother had once told me that my eyes were a gift from the universe, but I never believed her, until Harry mentioned that they were beautiful. His interest made me want to take better care of myself, so I started buying new clothes and dressing better, trying to convince myself that I really was pretty, no matter what anyone else thought. I just needed to hold on to that one compliment from him. After a few days, I started putting on makeup for all my classes and looking for ways to make my lips, which were huge and asymmetrical, look smaller and prettier. I even bought contact lenses to make my eyes stand out more. It really wasn't my style to obsess over things, except maybe the Chihuahua I had in 3rd grade who followed me everywhere until he sadly died. Or my best friend from my senior year of high school, who I lost in an accident. Those losses had always made me afraid to get close to people, but with Henry it was different, and I couldn't help but feel attracted to him. What can I tell you? I fell madly in love, and when he started noticing the changes he was making in me, he became even more obsessed. From that moment on, I no longer waited for Henry to bring me coffee. I took control myself. His smiles were bright as he noticed my efforts, and he began bringing me flowers and leaving me love notes. Finally, in one of those notes, he asked me to be his girlfriend. At first I smiled as I read it, but soon I felt my heart break. And I'm sure you're wondering why. And well, it's just because I didn't want to be the ugly girlfriend among the girls in his group. That's how big my ugliness complex was. That's why I said no. But then, it started to haunt me even more. Henry became more devoted, determined not to accept my rejection. I tried to explain why I didn't want to be with him, telling him that I didn't want to deal with labels, that I didn't want what his group thought of me to define my worth. If they saw me as ugly, by dating him, I would become the ugly girlfriend forever. Henry is the last guy to call me pretty again. With every compliment he paid me about my eyelashes, nails, fingers, waist, hair, eyes, and lips, my love for him was growing. Although a part of me was still hesitant and just smiled and nodded as usual, but in the end, I agreed to be his girlfriend. The problem was, because of how much I had fallen in love, my obsession took over and I didn't care when I heard the inappropriate whispers from his friends behind my back. I didn't mind what they had to say about me. Everything was going fine until I heard Henry refer to me as his ugly girl. I can never forget that. It was just before summer vacation when I told him I wasn't going to attend class because I was feeling a little under the weather. Soon after, he showed up at my house with medication, and I felt so loved and cared for. He kissed me goodbye, and even though I should have stayed in bed, after taking the pills he brought, I felt better and decided to go to class. It was our last chance to be together before the vacations began. I had barely entered the classroom when I heard the teasing. One of his friends yelled, "Your ugly girl didn't come in today." And my stomach flipped at the sight of Henry laughing. "Yeah, Biggie's sick today, so I don't have to kiss those huge lips, at least not this day." I winced as I heard him scoff, and tears began to fall down my cheeks. I couldn't believe my ears. I didn't have the courage to go into the classroom. I just walked away quickly and retreated to my room, crying myself to sleep. When I woke up, I decided that maybe he was just trying to impress his friends, and that as long as he didn't break up with me, everything would be fine. I wasn't willing to lose my only love. But that night, during dinner, Henry announced to me that he wanted to break up. I tried to protest, but he hurt me with cruel words, and that's when I saw his true face. It turns out, he was just having fun at my expense, manipulating my feelings as some kind of cruel joke with his friends. I left with a broken heart and forever scarred by this humiliation. I spent the whole night crying, and the week was even harder, until finally, I received news that changed everything. Henry's body was found at the foot of a cliff, a place we used to go on our dates. Death always hurts, but with every line I read in the news, I felt a strange joy fill my heart. He did well. Apparently his head was smashed in and his legs were broken. The story of her death reminded me of my Chihuahua and my best friend. The way those losses coincided with when they thought they could leave me alone was almost poetic. I remember my cousin who came to visit me when I was in 3rd grade, and how she became attached to my Chihuahua. Every time she left, my little dog would get stressed. And so it was that the night before she returned, my little Chihuahua died of poisoning. And then there was my best friend whose parents decided to move. She told me she was going with them, and I was so hurt that I begged her not to, but she wouldn't listen. Unfortunately, she died in a car accident on the way to her new home. Something went wrong with the engine, but his parents survived. As I recalled those experiences, a huge smile broke out on my ugly lips. This is how they should pay for leaving me alone after making me love them. But Henry was the worst of them all, so he got an ending befitting the pain he caused. It's called justice. What did he think he was doing calling me pretty like that and then deciding to break up with me? Looking back, I don't know why I liked him in the first place. Why did he catch me in that trap of love words and then have fun at my expense? It was time for him, along with everyone else, to pay for making me suffer. It was the spring of 2017, and I was living in a small apartment in Brooklyn with my best friend Claire. We had both come to New York from our respective towns in the country, and believe me, we were completely overwhelmed by how big the city was. We met in a coffee shop when we heard our southern accents. She had grown up in Kentucky, while I came from West Virginia. We had had very similar childhoods, filled with rural landscapes and simple traditions. So we had a lot in common in terms of humor and tastes, so we quickly clicked. However, there was one big difference between us. While Claire was sad to leave her family, friends, and small town, I didn't feel the same way. My home was a complicated place. It was full of drama and emotional scars we carried from childhood. My parents weren't bad, but the tragedy that struck us as a child left a deep mark on our family. And although I often wore a guise of confidence, inside I dealt with a pain that never seemed to dissipate. Despite our differences, getting to know Claire was a blessing. However, as we settled more into New York life, we began to crave a little more male connection. You know how it is. Sometimes just being together isn't enough, so we decided to try our luck with some dating apps. While Claire enjoyed Bumble, where it was the girls who started the conversations, I was overwhelmed by Tinder and Hinge. But to my surprise, Claire matched with a rather interesting guy. The guy was attractive, smart, and also from the South, although he said he had moved around a lot as a kid and didn't feel like he was from anywhere in particular. After a few dates, she decided to bring him to our apartment to introduce him to me so I could finally get to know his place. It was a promising night. Claire was nervous but excited, and I was somewhat anxious to meet her new guy. I was on my couch watching Netflix and devouring some cookies when I heard the door open. Then Claire walked in with her date, and I started making some introductions and engaging in casual conversation. But as I was talking to him, something began to unsettle me. There was something oddly familiar about his face. Unfortunately, this is the moment when my story takes a dark turn. At the age of 10, I lost my brother Ryan. His killer was someone my family knew well, and that had always haunted me. I was only 6 years old when my parents decided to leave me with my grandparents and told me it would only be for one night. But after 3 days, they finally came back and told me Ryan wasn't coming back. The explanation they gave was that he had gone to heaven. Death was a confusing concept to me at that age, and although I was sad that I would never see my brother again, the real pain came much later. I didn't fully understand what it meant to lose someone permanently until I got a little older. Finding out the circumstances surrounding Ryan's death was what really broke me. And at some point, I learned that he had been murdered, and that the person responsible had been a friend of his, someone who was supposed to have loved him. That boy's name was Marcus Clark, and it was still echoing in my head to this day. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone so thin and scruffy had been able to cause my family so much pain. As I listened to Claire laugh and flirt with her date on the couch, her boy's face began to morph into Marcus's in my mind. My heart raced as I realized that the guy I knew was connected to my brother's death. At that moment, the laughter felt like a distant echo as my memories of Ryan began to flood me. I tried to focus on the conversation, but every time I looked at the guy, I saw the shadow of a painful past that I had tried to bury. I remembered Ryan's laughter, his face lighting up with joy on picnics, only to be erased by the rawness of reality. Behind his smile, there were sinister secrets that still haunted me. Overwhelmed and feeling like I could take it anymore, I abruptly got up from the couch. I felt space closing in around me, and I needed to get away from it. Claire could tell something wasn't right and asked me, but I told her I just needed fresh air and ran out of the apartment, trying to escape the oppressive feeling of being back in that horrible moment of my childhood. During the time I stood behind the door, trying to breathe, the weight of the memories weighed on my chest like a slab. I didn't know if I could let this new guy into Claire's life, and I couldn't help but think that sometimes the past has a strange way of manifesting itself at the most unexpected times. I remember that guy's eyes were such a dark brown that they honestly looked black. Those eyes became the stars of many nightmares I had over the years, and everything became even more terrifying when I finally learned the truth about how he had murdered my brother. Marcus's confession left me cold. Ryan, my brother, had been playing near the railroad tracks one afternoon when Marcus, who was a neighborhood kid, found an old railroad part lying around. It was a heavy piece of metal, and although he said it felt like he was carrying something huge, he decided that would make a good toy. Then, while Ryan was bent over tying his shoes, Marcus just looked at it. And in that instant, madness took over and he started imagining what it would sound like if he hit my brother with that piece of metal. And that's exactly what he did. I remember being told that it was a horrible blow which left him convulsing. At that point, Marcus realized he had gotten himself into trouble, and instead of running to help, he decided to hide what he had done. He hit him over the head once more, and then, in a panic according to him, he dug a shallow grave and dragged his body a distance of about 100 yards. I heard that the injuries Ryan received were gruesome. Not only did he hit him, but after dragging him, they did unimaginable things to him. Sometimes it's hard for me to process what I heard, but what I can't forget is how his eyes and fingers were missing as if someone had wanted to tear him completely apart. All of that was scary. But the idea that this kid, who used to be one of my brother's friends, had done something like that, left me speechless. The police questioned Marcus, but instead of burying his conscience, he decided to lie and say that the injuries were a result of what he had done afterwards. How could they let him get away with that? In the end, because he was so young, they sent him to a reform school and gave him a new identity when he turned 18. Really? The power of youth over justice. Horrible, isn't it? For years, nightmares haunted me, and the more I knew about Ryan's death, the more real they became. I dreamed that Marcus came back and tried to do the same to me. I had no idea where he was, but on those nights, I felt like I was one step away from him. Marcus's dark eyes followed me wherever I went and were like lurking shadows, ready to catch me. The city became a terrifying place, and though life went on, I could only think of that shadow looming over me, reminding me that some nightmares don't end when you wake up. The shadows left by Ryan's death were still very much alive in my mind, and the echo of his loss still resonated too loudly. I can't stop thinking about my brother, and now comes the time to find out what's going on. The only thing I really remembered about Marcus were his cold dark eyes and messy hair. Those features became the characteristics of this monster I had created in my mind. Over time, nightmares began to orbit them, turning any shadow of a dark lock into a constant horror. That night, when I met Claire's Bumble date, a funny thing happened to me. Although the guy was attractive, there was something about the color of his eyes and the way he acted that I found disturbing. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to scare Claire for no reason. But as we talked, I began to put the pieces together. It was clear that he was reluctant to talk about his family and always deflected the topic when we touched on his childhood. But when he mentioned something traumatic that had happened to him as a child, his expression changed. That's when everything felt weird. The atmosphere became heavy, as if something wasn't right. When I mentioned to him that I grew up in West Virginia, he gave me a guilty look that was like a punch in the gut. Suddenly, light chatter turned into a silent competition, a battle of tension-filled stares. Claire, who was aware of my discomfort, asked me what was going on. Her nervous laughter didn't help. because I couldn't explain what I was feeling. At that moment, the atmosphere was charged with memories I didn't want to remember, like Marcus's shadow lurking. Without thinking, I asked, "Marcus?" The question was out of my mouth before I could stop myself, and the way he looked at me next, those dark eyes taking up his whole being, chilled my blood. There he stood before me, my brother's killer, and my worst nightmares had come true. "I should go," he said, as if he knew that in an instant, everything had become dangerous. I couldn't find the words, so I just stood there in shock as Claire said, "What just happened? Who's Marcus? Wait, where are you going?" It was as if time had stopped, and before I could realize it, he slipped out the door. I only managed to mutter, "Don't come back." Confusion washed over me. Everything I had done to get through this nightmare seemed to come crashing down in an instant. I had this reaction so intense, it was almost comical. It was as if the universe was playing with me, throwing Marcus right in my path in the big city, like reminding me that I couldn't escape the past, let alone the pain of Ryan's death. Claire tried to calm me down and started a random conversation. "New York is huge, isn't it? It's the best place to get lost in the crowd," she said to comfort me. Her support was incredible during that nightmare and helped solidify our friendship even more. Through this craziness, I learned something valuable. You never know who you're talking to. They may seem charming and perfectly normal, but behind that facade there could be a dark side you can't even imagine. Maybe they might even give you fairy tales, but at the end of the day, they're just trying to hide their sins. The blood will always be on their hands, no matter how much they try to wash it off. That was the last time I saw Marcus, who now has another name, and since then I have had no peace. It's as if everything I wanted to escape from is following me, and whenever I go out for a walk around town or to work, I'm in constant fear of running into him again. Deep down, I really hope that after that awkward encounter with me, he decided to move out, because judging by his attitude that night, I'm sure he's desperate to get away from that past too. It was almost noon and everything seemed bright and lively. The sun was positioning itself in the center of the sky, and a warm breeze was sneaking through the blinds as I raised them to allow more light to flood into my living room. I stared out the window, lost in thought. Remembering what was occupying my mind at that moment was more complicated than solving a puzzle, but I know I was trying to finish a couple of jobs I had pending. I just needed a breather. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I jumped out of fright and ran to open it, without thinking too much about who it might be. "Sophie!" shouted an energetic voice. It was Lauren. I didn't bother to ask her why she hadn't told me before she came. That was normal between us. Since I started working from home, my friends used to show up unannounced, knowing they were likely to find me there. Lauren came in and gave me a light but warm hug. Her visit was just what I needed to take a break from the routine, so I pulled some cake out of the fridge, and that became our brunch. We sat and chatted, full of laughter and ruminations. However, I suddenly noticed that she had a strange look on her face. I saw that she was staring at something outside the window. I followed her gaze and realized that she was looking at the house right in front of mine. At first I only saw a parked van, but then I noticed an older woman, probably in her 60s, carrying boxes and some other things that looked like belongings. She was alone, moving heavy things, with a determined but somewhat unsettling air. I couldn't quite see what they were, as everything was wrapped in blankets and cloths. "What are you looking at?" I asked Lauren, trying to understand what she was so intrigued by. "It's strange. It gives me bad vibes. Doesn't it feel that way?" she said, and I actually agreed with her. That uneasy feeling came over me, but I didn't want to dwell on it. She was just a new neighbor, and I didn't want fear to take over my life. Besides, her house was right across the street and should be ignored. We laughed again, and the conversation drifted away from the old lady to other lighter topics. But a few days later, one morning when the dawn light finally began to peek through, I found myself working in the living room, and suddenly a strange noise made me look up. There was a little boy standing in front of the old woman's door. Before I could think to knock on the door, it burst open and the child entered as if in some kind of trance. His face was unclear to me, but I felt a shiver run through me. That same night, I noticed a teenage girl walking through the same door, and once again, not a word was exchanged. The teenager walked in as if someone was guiding her like a puppet. Confusion and unease welled up in me. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that there was nothing strange about any of this. But part of me knew something else was going on. Maybe I was just imagining weird things because of how I had felt the first time I saw the old woman. I thought, so I tried to tune her out and focus on more important things, but I couldn't help but notice how strange everything was with her. She hardly ever left her house. She never took walks at night, nor did she ever show up at the neighborhood store. It had been 2 weeks since she moved in, and although more than 10 people visited her, I never saw anyone leave. Her house was always quiet, so I couldn't assume she lived with company. The visitors were almost all children and teenagers, and of course it was rare not to see anyone her age. I wanted to concentrate on my work and forget all about the old lady, but it just wasn't working. So I decided to go check it out for myself. After 3 hours in the kitchen, I had baked an apple pie, let it cool a bit, and, plucked up my courage, headed for her house. I knocked on the door several times and got no answer, but I knew she had to be inside, because I didn't see her leave at any time. My frustration was growing, but I insisted that I was not going to give up. I couldn't accept that I left my job just to walk there in vain. Finally, I started to hear slow footsteps approaching the door. "Hi, I'm Sophie. I live right across the street," I said with a smile. The old lady accepted the cake, but stood on the threshold, as if hesitating. "May I come in?" I asked, and seeing her nod, I walked into the house. We entered in awkward silence, exchanging glances, until finally she spoke. "Wait here." She took the pie into the kitchen, and when she returned, she had a bright smile. "Come in," she said. I followed her deeper into the house. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. "Sure," I replied. She went to the kitchen, and the sound of boiling water started to make me unexpectedly sleepy. When I came back into focus, the woman was right in front of me, staring me straight in the eyes. "You're sleepy, aren't you?" she said. "I feel a little tired," I admitted. Suddenly my phone rang, snapping me out of my drowsiness. I jumped up, confused. "What's going on?" "Your phone is ringing," the woman said, avoiding my gaze. In an instant, she had reverted back to that shadowy figure I had seen at first. It was Lauren calling. Trembling, I returned to my house, my head full of questions I couldn't manage to answer. "Maybe he tried to hypnotize you," Lauren said upon hearing what had happened. I spent the next few days keeping a close eye on my neighbor, but to my surprise, she was no longer receiving visitors. But one morning, there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, I saw 2 policemen. "Is there a problem?" I asked, confused. "We have some questions about your neighbor," one of them said. What I heard next chilled me. They were calling her a hypnotist murderer. My God, I had barely been to her house days before. "You're lucky you weren't a victim," said one. "She stalks her victims and hypnotizes them into visiting her house." Jesus, they had her under arrest. Was she supposed to testify? She had seen people enter her house, moving like zombies, unwillingly. Of course I would, even if I feared she would hypnotize me again. She could go away for life, maybe 3 lifetimes.